The station went dark 40 seconds before the first breach. Sergeant Dario Voss noticed it the way a man notices the silence before a dog barks, not with his ears, but with the back of his neck. The ambient hum of Relay Station Kessler 9 had been his constant companion for 11 months. He'd learned its rhythms the way sailors once learned the sound of rigging. The deep bass pulse of the main reactor cycling in 3-second intervals, the higher overtone of the coolant circulation, pumps running their perpetual loop through the station's skin, the faint white noise exhale of the atmospheric processors working against the cold. The whole structure breathed, and he'd learned to breathe with it, and when that hum dropped out of the air, he was already moving before his mind caught up with his body, pulling on his helmet and slamming the emergency seal on compartment 4. The lights came back on in emergency red. The red was an old design decision, from when designers thought red light would preserve night vision during emergencies. What it actually did was make every corridor look like the inside of something biological, something breathing, something with its own agenda. Dario had never liked the emergency lighting. He liked it less now. The station's AI gave him a damage report in 11 syllables. Hull breach, sections 7 through 9, external pressure nominal, internal, and then it stopped. Not a pause, a stopping. The kind of stopping that has no continuation on the other side of it, no buffering indicator, no restart sequence. It was the particular silence of something that had been alive and was no longer. Someone had killed the AI. Dario stood in the dim red corridor of the forward operations deck and did a fast inventory. He had one standard-issue Terran defense carbine with 4 full magazines and a partial fifth, one sidearm with 2 magazines, 4 fragmentation grenades, 2 smoke canisters, a trauma kit, and about 200 meters of corridor standing between him and the emergency beacon array. The beacon was the only thing that mattered. The nearest TDF response vessel was 6 hours out. The beacon had to run for 6 hours. That was the math. He had sat with this math for the 23 seconds it had taken him to get his gear on, and he'd made his peace with it, and now he was done sitting with it. The math was what the math was. He'd known, when he chose to stay, that the math might be ugly. He'd stayed anyway, which meant he'd already made the essential decision, which meant all the subsequent decisions were just details. He didn't know yet that there were 800 of them. He found out when he reached the first junction and saw the sensor ghost on his wrist display. A screen capture the AI had dumped before it died, a last gift from a system that had known it was being killed and had used its final processing cycles to tell him the one thing he most needed to know. His wrist display wasn't networked. It was just a dumb screen pulling from a hard-wired local camera feed, and what the camera showed him was the exterior of Kessler 9 docking ring. Ship after ship after ship, petal-shaped, dark as polished obsidian, locked into the station's emergency ports like leeches finding a vein. He counted the docking clamps that had engaged, lost count at 40, looked at the scale of the fleet behind the docked ships, stopped trying to count. 800. That was the number that would come to him later when it was over and he had time to sit with it. The official fleet enumeration was 812 individual units, ranging from single-occupant insertion pods to 12-person assault shells. Not 800 individual soldiers, necessarily. Maybe 5,000 or 6,000. The Meridian insertion doctrine packed soldiers into their shells the way you'd pack anything valuable for transport. Tightly, efficiently, without regard for the comfort of the cargo. But in the moment, standing in a red-lit corridor with his helmet's filter cutting the acrid smell of ruptured chemical seals to something merely unpleasant, Dario Voss did not think about numbers. He thought about the beacon array. He thought about the layout of the station. He thought about 11 months of maintenance rounds that had given him an understanding of Kessler 9 internal geography so granular he could have walked it blind, and might, before this was over, need to. Then he started walking. Commander Velarath of the 3rd Meridian Vanguard, watched the human begin to walk on the feed from the station's own cameras, which her team had cut over to her flagship's display array within the first 40 seconds of the breach. She was standing, not sitting, at the observation tier of her command platform. This was unusual. Velareth was known throughout the Meridian fleet for the quality of her stillness. She could stand at a post for 6 hours without shifting her weight, without the subconscious micro-movements that betrayed biological discomfort in most of her species. Other commanders called it discipline. Her crew called it something closer to worship, though not to her face. She watched the human. He moved with a kind of unhurried economy that she hadn't anticipated. She had studied Terran military engagements in the data archives, 14 years of contact, 43 documented engagements, thousands of hours of raw footage. She understood human soldiers in the aggregate. They were aggressive, adaptive, poorly suited for long engagements but extraordinarily dangerous in short ones, prone to emotional escalation and decision-making that violated probability modeling in ways that frequently worked out in their favor. What she had not expected was this. This one walked the way water runs downhill. The route he chose was not the shortest, it was not the most fortified. But as she watched, she began to understand that he was threading the station's geometry with a specific logic, minimizing the number of sight lines available to an advancing force, choosing intersections where he could not be flanked from behind, positioning himself always at the junction between cover and mobility rather than committing fully to either. He was not running away, he was not hiding, he was building a position. "Send Team 1 through Section 7, she said, without turning away from the display. "Team 1 has entered Section 7. Designate all camera feeds to my screen. Do not filter, do not process." Her aide hesitated. "The volume of—" "Do not filter," she said. Every camera on Kessler 9 bloomed across her display array, a mosaic of red-lit corridors and drifting chemical vapor, and the methodical, unhurried movement of 812 Meridian insertion soldiers moving through a structure that had been designed to house 47 humans. And in the middle of all of it, the lone figure of Dario Voss, moving steadily toward the beacon array, checked every corner before he turned it, and appeared to be in no particular hurry. Velareth watched him the way she'd watched 1,000 enemies before. This was different, she couldn't yet say how. The first contact happened at the junction she'd thought of as the bottleneck before she'd even gotten there. The point where Sections 4 and 5 merged into the main operations corridor. The corridor widened there, which most soldiers would read as an advantage, more room to maneuver. Dario had learned to read widened corridors as ambush architecture. He smelled them before he saw them, or rather, his helmet filtered out the chemical vapor, and in the absence of those chemical signatures, he smelled something else. Something faintly organic and faintly wrong, like copper and ozone and the inside of a car left in the sun. He'd smelled it before in the briefing files, in the forensic reports from the engagement at Tycho Station. He flattened against the wall and put his back to the bulkhead and waited. The first Meridian soldier came around the corner in the cautious, probing way of a species that had learned caution through geological time. They were bipedal, roughly human in height and proportion but not in form. Their torsos were longer, their limbs folded at different angles. Their helmets were faceless smooth white ovals that caught the red emergency light and turned it amber. They moved quietly. Their weapon systems were good. They had numbers beyond any reasonable calculation of what one human could survive. But they had not anticipated the junction. He caught the first one before she'd fully committed to the turn. A single controlled burst, 3 rounds, center mass, and she went down. The second came through the same corner 3 seconds later, faster, having heard the shots, and he caught her too. Third came wide, trying to use the corridor's open space for flanking, and he'd been expecting that, and that one went down at the far wall. Then they stopped sending soldiers through the junction, and instead sent a flashbang. He'd expected that too. He was already through the hatch he'd propped open at his back, pulling it sealed behind him, letting the percussion blow past on the other side of 6 centimeters of reinforced bulkhead. The sound reached him as a dull thump, the way thunder sounds from inside a building, present but contained, deprived of its teeth. He gave himself 4 seconds to breathe. Counted them the way his training sergeant had taught him. Not fast counting, not slow counting, but the specific rhythm of a man doing something deliberate, something controlled, something that meant he was still choosing and not simply reacting. 4 counts. His heartbeat was up. That was fine. Elevated heart rate was information, not emergency. Then he kept moving. Behind him, the corridor at the junction held 3 soldiers who would not be reporting back. He did not feel good about this. He hadn't felt good about it the first time, in the training exercises where the targets were holograms, and he hadn't felt good about it at Helix Point where the targets weren't, and he didn't feel good about it now. This was the thing the recruitment materials never quite said, and the training tried to prepare you for and couldn't, not really, that you could be entirely correct in a choice, and the correct choice could still cost something. That the math could add up and the answer could still sit wrong. He carried it the way he carried the fear, the same way. Forward. Velareth watched the human vanish through the hatch with something she took several seconds to identify as surprise. It wasn't the speed. She'd seen human reaction times and they were genuinely impressive. It wasn't the accuracy, 3 targets, 3 kills, a respectable outcome for any soldier. What surprised her was the hatch. He'd propped it open beforehand. He had positioned himself at that junction, knowing he would need to retreat, and he had created his retreat before the engagement began. He hadn't been standing there to fight. He'd been standing there to kill 3 soldiers and leave. Team 2, she said. Team 2 is in Section 4. Hold them. Her aide turned. Commander, if we hold Team 2, the human reaches. I know where he reaches, Velareth said. Hold Team 2. Send 1 scout. Single unit, forward observation only. I want eyes on where he goes next. There was a pause. Just 1, her aide asked. Just 1, she confirmed. She went back to watching the screens. She found the human on camera 34. The overhead unit in Section 3's maintenance crawlspace. He was moving through it on his elbows, faster than she would have predicted, his body compact and efficient. She found she was standing closer to the screen than she'd been a moment ago. She hadn't moved deliberately. She wasn't sure when she'd moved. She studied the camera feed. She studied the way he used his elbows, planting them wide for stability and speed rather than narrow for stealth. She studied the set of his shoulders, the way they carried no visible tension, which she knew from her research was unusual in human combat engagements. She looked at the way his hand rested on the rifle when he wasn't actively using it, not tight, not loose, not braced for action but not careless either. Ready but resting. There was a quality to it she could not name using any of the operational vocabulary the Meridian military had developed for characterizing enemy combatants. The word she would have used if she'd had access to human vocabulary in that moment was comfortable. He was comfortable. Not comfortable with dying, she didn't think it was that. She had observed soldiers who had accepted death, and they had a specific quality, a kind of dissolution, an untethering from outcome that showed itself in small ways. The loosening of the grip, the slowing of the breath, the strange serenity of a decision already finished. He didn't have that. He was alert, present, watching everything, just not tense about it. Not frightened in the manner she had observed in the archive footage of captured human soldiers, where the fear showed in the hands and the jaw and the speed of the eyes. This was something else. This was a person who had been afraid for, she checked the timer, 43 minutes, and who had continued being productive and methodical and deliberately unhurried for all 43 of those minutes, and who was apparently able to hold both the fear and the productivity in the same body at the same time, without one erasing the other. The Meridian physiological vocabulary did not have a term for this. She had 14 years of research notes and not a single classification for this. How was he comfortable? What do we know about this station's crew manifest? She asked. 47 registered personnel. 46 evacuated on emergency transports when the first alert went out. This one, her aide paused, scrolling. Sergeant Dario Voss, listed as mission-critical technical liaison. He stayed behind to ensure the beacon array remained active during the evacuation window. Velareth processed this. He stayed behind voluntarily. That appears to be the case. She looked at the screens. To protect a beacon. The array transmits continuous automated distress on 38 frequencies simultaneously. Shutting it down was our second priority after the AI, but the physical access points are. Her aide paused again, with something that in a human might have read as reluctance. They're deep in the station, behind the operations corridor. Where he's going. Velareth understood. The beacon array was behind him. He'd been walking toward it the whole time. She'd been watching him move toward the one piece of this station that her entire fleet needed to shut down before the 6-hour window expired. And he'd been walking there with the unhurried economy of a man going to a meeting he'd scheduled for himself. Team 3, she said, I want them at the forward access point to the beacon array, now. He smelled the ambush at the beacon array before he reached it. Not literally. His helmet's filter systems were still cutting 90% of the chemical signatures. But there was a different kind of perception that 11 months on a deep space relay station developed, and 8 months before that in the asteroid corridor engagement at Kepler 7, and 14 months before that in the first Meridian contact at Helix Point. It was the perception of a building that was supposed to be empty and wasn't. A certain quality in the silence. A weight to the absence of sound that told you the sound was being carefully made not to exist. He stopped at the maintenance junction 30 meters from the beacon array's access hatch and sat down with his back against the wall and thought. They'd had time to position. They knew where he was going, of course they knew. There was exactly one place on Kessler 9 worth defending, and they weren't idiots. They'd be in the corridor. They might be in the array room itself if they'd gotten the outer hatch open, which was possible but would have taken tools he wasn't sure the Meridian insertion teams routinely carried. So, corridor ambush, probably staged with overlapping fields of fire, probably in numbers large enough to make direct approach suicidal. Direct approach was suicidal. He thought about what he had. He thought about the layout of the station with the specific, almost geological patience of a man who had spent 11 months learning every corridor and junction and access point and crawlspace and utility shaft and pressure valve and structural weak point of a station he'd been sent to maintain, and he thought about what he could do with it. He pulled up the station schematic on his wrist display, old-fashioned hardwired schematic, not networked, not hackable, just a printed circuit diagram photographed and stored before he deployed. He zoomed in. He looked at the section behind the beacon array. There was a coolant line access shaft. It ran parallel to the main corridor at about head height. It was not a crawl space. It was barely a space at all. It was 60 centimeters wide, the minimum allowable by the station construction spec, designed to allow a technician to replace coolant line segments with maximum inconvenience and minimum grace. He had spent 2 hours in it in month 4, replacing a cracked joint. He had thought several unkind thoughts about the station's designer and had measured himself against the walls, as you do when you're uncomfortable and bored and trying to distract yourself. He was 62 centimeters wide at the shoulders. He could fit, barely, sideways with the rifle held flat across his chest. He looked at where the shaft terminated. It came out directly behind the beacon array's secondary power coupling, inside the array room. He put his back against the wall and thought about the 63 soldiers he estimated were in that corridor, and he thought about the shaft, and he decided the shaft was going to work, and then he stopped thinking about it and started moving. Velareth watched Team 3 take their positions in the corridor outside the beacon array with the detached analytical focus she usually reserved for post-engagement debriefings. 63 soldiers in a corridor. Standard overlapping cover formation, staggered, the way the Meridian tactical doctrine specified for ambush scenarios in contained linear spaces. She'd reviewed that doctrine. She'd helped write some of it. She watched Camera 47, the junction camera, the last one with line of sight on the human, and she watched him stop. She watched him sit down. "Is he injured?" her aide asked. "He is thinking," Velareth said. Her aide did not respond to this. She watched him think. He sat against the wall with the rifle across his lap and his head back, and he was still for slightly under 4 minutes. She counted. She watched his chest rise and fall, and she watched his hands on the rifle, and she noted that they were still, not white-knuckled, not fidgeting, simply still. At rest. 4 minutes. He had 63 soldiers waiting to kill him 30 meters away, and he sat still for 4 minutes. Then he got up and moved to the maintenance shaft junction, and she lost him. She lost him for 7 minutes and 42 seconds. Which was the longest 7 minutes and 42 seconds she had experienced in a career spanning 30 years of Meridian military service. During those 7 minutes and 42 seconds, she did not move from the display array. She did not speak. She scanned every camera on the station's operational sector, and she could not find him, and the knowledge that she could not find him produced a sensation in her chest that she was not immediately able to classify. She found it in the station's structural schematics, the coolant access shaft, running parallel to the main corridor. She found the terminus. She looked at what the terminus put him behind. "Team 3, she said. "Check." The sound of gunfire from the beacon array carried through the station's hull vibration sensors and reached her command platform as a faint, rhythmic percussion, like something knocking on a door from a long way away. Then the sound stopped. Then her comm channel from Team 3 went silent. The array room was smaller than it looked on the schematic. Schematics never accounted for the presence of the actual machinery, the banks of transmitter hardware that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls and generated enough ambient heat to turn the room into a sauna. Dario had been counting on that heat. The Meridian soldiers in the corridor were equipped with thermal imaging. The array room was 62 degrees Celsius inside, which made thermal imaging approximately as useful as reading by starlight. He'd come out of the shaft fast, faster than the shaft had any right to allow given how tight it was, leveraging off the coolant line itself to pull himself through the last 2 meters, and he came out already moving. The 2 soldiers who'd made it into the array room didn't have time to reposition. He gave them no time. That was the calculation. Speed was the only variable he controlled in a space with 2 armed opponents who'd been expecting him to come through the door. They had not been expecting him to come through the wall. Then he'd sealed the inner hatch, blown the exterior hatch with one of the fragmentation grenades positioned against the hinge assembly, not destroying the hatch, just jamming it permanently, a trick he'd seen in an engineering memo he'd read in month 2 out of sheer boredom, and set the remaining grenade against the corridor wall at the junction point with the tripwire from his trauma kit. Then he sat down next to the beacon array transmitter bank, which was running on emergency power, which was fine, which was all it needed, and he listened to the sounds of 61 soldiers trying to get through a jammed hatch, and then one of them stepping on a tripwire. After that, there were 54 soldiers trying to get through a jammed hatch, and they were doing it more carefully. He had time. He used it to check his ammunition first, a habit so deeply ingrained it happened before he consciously decided to do it, the hands moving while the mind was still catching up. 2 full magazines for the carbine, 1 partial, 2 for the sidearm, not nothing, not much. But the math on what he needed the ammo to do had changed significantly. He no longer needed it to fight his way to the beacon array. He was already at the beacon array. Now, he just needed it to dissuade anyone who made it through the inner hatch from immediately killing him, for as long as the beacon needed to run. That was a different equation, simpler in some ways. He checked the structural integrity of the inner hatch next, running his fingers along the seal points, testing the hinge assembly he damaged with the grenade, feeling for vibration that would tell him someone was cutting rather than forcing. Cutting was worse. Cutting meant they'd adapted to the jammed hatch and were working around it, which meant they were thinking rather than pushing. Thinking opponents were more dangerous than pushing ones, because thinking could produce something he hadn't anticipated, and he'd gotten this far on the strength of anticipating correctly. He felt no vibration that suggested cutting. They were still pushing, still trying to force a hatch that had been wedged shut with the kind of engineering stubbornness that the station's designers had probably never intended to be applied in anger. Kessler 9 had been built to keep space outside and humans inside. He had turned that design intent sideways and used it to keep Meridian soldiers outside and himself inside, and for the moment it was holding. He sat down with his back against the transmitter bank and ate half of a nutrition bar he'd been carrying in his left thigh pocket since morning. It tasted like chalk and synthetic vanilla. He ate it because he didn't know when he'd get another chance, and because his hands needed something to do that wasn't thinking about the math of how long he could hold this room against 800 soldiers with 2 magazines and a sidearm, and because he was hungry, and being hungry was a thing you could actually do something about, which made it one of the more manageable problems currently on his list. 6 hours. He needed the beacon to run for 6 hours. He'd been awake for 19 hours already. He could feel it in the specific way that extreme fatigue made itself known after the adrenaline had burned off. Not a heaviness, not exactly, but a quality to his thoughts, a slight imprecision at the edges, as if he was thinking through a medium that was subtly denser than usual. He'd been awake longer before in worse circumstances. He knew the texture of it. He knew how to work inside it. The transmitter bank behind him was warm against his back. The beacon pulsed its patient, continuous signal outward on 38 frequencies, a digital heartbeat, steady and even. He could feel it through the housing more than he could hear it, a vibration in his spine, a reminder that the thing he'd stayed to protect was still doing the only thing it needed to do. He was afraid. He had been afraid since the lights went red. The fear was a constant presence, a note held steady in the back of his chest, and he had spent the last several hours doing everything else around it while it continued to hold its note, and he expected it would continue doing so until this was over one way or another. That was fine. The fear was not the problem. The fear was just the sound a human body makes when it understands what it's doing. He ate the chalk vanilla nutrition bar and listened to the beacon transmit on 38 frequencies simultaneously, and thought about the geometry of the room and where the next breach was likely to come from. And he was afraid, had been afraid since the moment the lights went red. But the fear was a familiar thing now, like a coat he'd been wearing long enough that he'd stopped feeling its weight. Velarath stood at the display array for 3 hours and 7 minutes. She didn't sit, she didn't eat. She stood and watched the feed from the corridor outside the beacon array room, and she watched her soldiers work with methodical precision. Because her soldiers were good, the best insertion units in the 3rd Meridian Vanguard, trained for exactly this kind of breach and secure operation, equipped with tools and weapons that had no business failing against a single opponent. And she watched the inner hatch hold. She watched the station's thermal sensors register 62 degrees inside the array room, which she had initially considered an obstacle to her soldiers, and now understood had been a deliberate choice on the human's part, a choice made months ago when he'd taken a technical role on the station and familiarized himself with its properties. He had been preparing for this. Not for this specifically, no one prepared for 800 soldiers, but for the general shape of this, for the situation in which preparation was the only thing that stood between the beacon running and the beacon not running. She stood and listened to the beacon transmit on 38 frequencies simultaneously, which meant she could hear it on her own equipment, which meant every vessel within 20 light minutes could also hear it, which meant that the operation had, in the most fundamental sense, already failed, and the only remaining question was how many soldiers she would lose trying to reach an objective that was already broadcasting its location to the people who were coming to defend it. She had 6 hours from breach to beacon shutdown. That was the operational window, calculated on known TDF response times, adjusted for the nearest available response vessel's last recorded position, verified 3 times by her logistics team before the operation commenced. Rigorous, thorough, accurate as far as it went. The thing the window had not accounted for was the person who had decided to hold the room. At 3 hours and 7 minutes, she had used slightly over half her window and her soldiers had not reached the beacon. She thought about the human inside the array room. She found she had been thinking about him for most of those 3 hours and 7 minutes, which was unusual. In 30 years of military service, she had not spent extended time thinking about individual enemy combatants. Thinking about the force profile, the tactical posture, the organizational doctrine, yes. The individual, rarely. The individual was, in the operational view, a variable in a larger equation, a unit in a formation, a representative of a broader pattern. She could not make this particular individual into a variable. Every time she tried, he did something that the variable could not account for. She thought about the way he'd walked, that specific economy of movement that wasn't speed and wasn't caution, but was something between them. She thought about the 4 minutes he'd spent sitting against the wall thinking. She thought about the coolant shaft that was 60 centimeters wide and his shoulders that had fit through it. She thought about the nutrition bar she could see him eating on the one camera still operational in the array room, an interior maintenance camera, too high to have been used in the combat, too obscure to have been on his mental map to disable. He was eating a nutrition bar and listening to the beacon and watching the inner hatch, and he was alone. She had been watching him for 3 hours and 7 minutes, and the thing she could not reconcile was the aloneness. In the Meridian military, soldiers did not operate alone. The tactical doctrine was explicit on this point. Isolation was the primary threat vector in any combat engagement, and the primary casualty multiplier. You kept your unit together. You maintained formation. You ensured line-of-sight communication with adjacent units at all times. He had been alone from the beginning. He had known he would be alone. He had apparently decided that this was fine. Velareth had a crew of 412 on her flagship. She had 812 soldiers in that station. She had 3 wings of support ships on standby at the edge of the system. She had, in any practical sense that could be measured or quantified, more resources than this single human soldier could ever plausibly overcome. She watched him eat his nutrition bar. Commander, her aide, the TDF response window. I know. At current progress, the inner hatch will breach in approximately 4 hours. The TDF vessel will arrive in. I know, she said again. She watched the camera. She thought about what she had studied, what she had cataloged. 14 years of contact, 43 engagements, thousands of hours of footage of human soldiers in the field. She had studied them the way the android programmer in her favorite cautionary fable had studied human anatomy, with obsessive precision, with the conviction that if she mapped every variable she would eventually understand the mechanism, the thing that made them capable of what they were capable of. She was beginning to suspect she had been studying the wrong variable. She had studied their tactics, their reaction times, their emotional volatility, their capacity for improvisation. She had categorized all of these things, and she had accounted for them in her operational planning, and she had accounted for them incorrectly, because the numbers were right, but the thing she'd actually been looking for wasn't in any of those categories. It was in the way he was eating a nutrition bar. She had 412 crew members, and she could ask any of them how they were feeling and receive a calibrated, accurate response about their emotional state, because the meridian physiological vocabulary for emotional states was precise and extensive, and had been cultivated over 3,000 years of civilization. She knew exactly how she felt about most things, most of the time. She did not know how to do what that human was doing. To be alone, genuinely alone, not as a condition but as a decision, not a loss but a chosen state, and to be eating a nutrition bar. To carry the full weight of everything that was happening and everything that might happen and the knowledge that there was no one else, and to eat a nutrition bar, and to watch the hatch. She thought about this for a long time. Then she did something she had never done in 30 years of meridian military service. She opened a direct communications channel to the station's interior. The comm request came in on a frequency Dario hadn't expected anyone to use, the station's emergency crew intercom. An old system, hardwired, the one that wasn't networked and hadn't been killed when the AI went down. It was so old that it wasn't on anyone's tactical checklist, which was presumably why it was still running. The translation buffer in his helmet identified the signal as Meridian Command Class encoding and converted it to English in about 4 seconds, which was faster than he'd expected. Sergeant Voss. He looked at the inner hatch. He looked at the nutrition bar. He said, "Yeah." A pause, not a long one. A pause of the kind that suggested the speaker was accustomed to not pausing and was doing it deliberately. "I am Commander Velarath of the 3rd Meridian Vanguard. I have been observing your actions since the breach." "I know," he said. "You have cameras everywhere." "You knew this?" "Yes." "And yet you continued." He thought about how to answer that. "You were going to watch me either way," he said. "I figured I might as well give you something worth watching." Another pause, longer this time. He ate the rest of the nutrition bar. "Why are you still here?" she said. "The evacuation transports departed. You could have been on one." "The beacon," he said. "You stayed alone, on a station being boarded by 800 soldiers for a beacon." "Yeah." "This is not," she stopped. "This is not a rational calculation." Dario thought about this. "It's rational," he said. 46 other people got off this station because there was a beacon running. The beacon needs someone here to make sure it stays running. I was the one who stayed. That's a rational calculation. The probability of your survival wasn't part of the calculation," he said. The silence lasted longer than either of the previous pauses, long enough that he checked the comm channel to make sure it was still active. It was. "You removed your own survival from the calculation," she said. "The mission was the calculation. I'm part of the mission. I don't get to prioritize myself over the mission." "Why not?" He opened his mouth and then closed it again. He thought about how to explain this to something that might not have a framework for it. He thought about his mother, who had been a nurse for 31 years, and had driven through a blizzard to make her shift when she had a fever of 40 degrees, because there was a patient who needed her, and no one else was going to show up. He thought about his training sergeant at Helix Point, who had been hit in the first minutes of the contact engagement there, and had continued to direct fire and coordinate the evacuation for 40 minutes with a wound that should have taken him down in the first 10, and had died on the transport with his boots on and his carbine in his hands. He thought about the 46 people on the evacuation transports. "Because I made a choice," he said, "and the choice mattered to other people. And when a choice matters to other people, you don't get to unmake it just because it became expensive." "A choice," she said, "that is." She stopped again. "What?" he said. "That is not something I have a word for," she said. "In any language I speak fluently." He sat with that for a moment. He thought about how that was probably the most honest thing he'd heard from anyone in quite a while, that precise admission of a gap in the vocabulary, the acknowledgement that the word didn't exist. Most people, when they ran into something they didn't have words for, pretended they did. They found the nearest approximation and called it close enough. It took something to say the gap out loud. Most things that matter don't have good words, he said. Your species has duty, she said. I understand this word. It exists in our vocabulary as well, though the translation loses something. It implies obligation imposed from outside, a debt, a contract with consequences for non-fulfillment. That's not what this is, he said. No, she agreed. This is something imposed from inside, a contract you made with yourself, but that is not quite right either. No, he thought about it. It's more like you look at what matters and you look at what you can do about it, and those two things connect. And once they connect, you can't disconnect them just because disconnecting them would be safer. A long pause. That is still not a word, she said. No, he said. I told you we don't have a good one. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might be done. Then she said, We have studied your species for 14 years. We have cataloged your biological traits, your tactical patterns, your psychological vulnerabilities, your cultural conventions. We have more data on human behavior than any other non-human species in recorded meridian history. And you still lost a relay station to one person eating a nutrition bar, he said. Another pause. He thought for a moment that the pause had an unusual quality to it, not the quality of offense, not the quality of calculation, but something almost like the conversational equivalent of a person sitting back in their chair. Yes, she said. We did. Velarath stood at the display array, and she listened to the human's voice, and she thought about what he'd said, and she felt something that she was not able to categorize in the meridian physiological vocabulary for emotional states, which was precise and extensive, and had been cultivated over 3,000 years of civilization. She thought, I have been trying to replicate human behavior in my tactical models for 14 years. She thought, I have had the wrong variable the entire time. She watched the inner hatch. She watched the timer counting toward the TDF response window. She did the mathematics cold, precise, inevitable, and she understood that the hatch would not breach in time, that the beacon would transmit for the full 6 hours, that the TDF vessel would arrive, and the operation would fail, and the third Meridian Vanguard would withdraw, which was the operationally correct response to an engagement that had gone outside parameters. She thought about what it would mean to tell this to her crew, to her fleet, to the Meridian High Command who had approved this operation, who had reviewed her tactical assessment, who had seen the odds and the numbers and the fleet size, and had not anticipated a single human sergeant eating a nutrition bar in a 62-degree room, while 38 simultaneous beacon frequencies told the galaxy exactly where to find him. She stood very still for a very long time. Then she opened the comm again. Sergeant Voss. Still here, he said, which she was beginning to understand was a kind of humor. I have a question. Go ahead. When you removed your survival from the calculation, she said, were you afraid? He didn't answer immediately. She watched the camera feed. He was looking at the inner hatch. Yeah, he said, I was afraid. And yet, he agreed. How? He was quiet for long enough that she thought the channel had dropped. Then he said, I don't know how to explain it to you. It's not that the fear goes away. It's that the thing you decided matters more than the fear does. The fear's there the whole time. You just stop letting it make your choices for you. Velarath stood in her command platform with her 412 crew members around her, and she thought about fear, and she thought about choices, and she thought about a programmer who had spent years trying to replicate human anatomy, trying to map every variable, and who had in doing so been led to the darkest corners of his own mind by the thing he was trying to understand. Because the thing he was trying to understand wasn't in any of the variables. The thing he was trying to understand was the space between the variables, the decision, the will, the choice to keep going after you'd accounted for all the reasons not to. She thought 14 years. She thought wrong variable the entire time. Sergeant Voss, she said. Yeah. Your beacon will reach the 6-hour window. The TDF vessel will arrive. I will withdraw my forces at the 4-hour 40-minute mark, which is operationally optimal for our withdrawal trajectory. A pause. Why are you telling me that? She considered the question. She said, because you stayed for 46 people and the decision mattered, and I did not want to leave without telling you that I understood. A very long pause. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Velareth. She was already moving away from the display, but she stopped. Yes. The thing I don't have a word for, he said. The choice that doesn't unmake itself. Your species has been fighting ours for 14 years and you haven't found a word for it. No, she said. We have a word for it. What is the word? Duty, he said. But it's not really accurate. That's just what we call it when we're trying to explain it to ourselves. She stood at her command platform for a long time after the channel closed. She tried to imagine a word that meant the choice that costs you everything and that you make anyway and that you do not unmake even when the cost becomes clear, because the cost was already visible when you made the choice, and you made it anyway, because the thing it was for was worth more than what it cost. She could not find one. She began to wonder if this was the thing her species had been misunderstanding for 14 years, not the tactics, not the reaction times, not the capacity for improvisation in combat. Those were all measurable. Those could all be accounted for. This could not be accounted for. This was not a tactical variable. This was not a psychological profile. This was not a physiological trait or an evolutionary adaptation or a cultural artifact. This was something that happened in the space between a human and a decision, in the moment after all the rational calculations had been completed, and the outcome was clear, and the choice was still made. She had studied humanity for 14 years, and she had never studied this. She walked away from the display. At 4 hours and 37 minutes, the sounds of soldiers working on the inner hatch stopped. Dario sat with his back against the transmitter bank and listened to the silence and understood what it meant. He sat there for a while after that. Not because he needed to, the math was done, the calculation was complete, the beacon was running and would keep running until the TDF vessel arrived, and there was nothing left for him to do except wait. He sat there because the room had been his for the last 4.5 hours, and he wasn't quite ready to give it back. He looked at the camera in the corner, the one that was too high to have been on his mental map, the one that had been running the whole time. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went back to watching the inner hatch out of habit, because that was what you did. The beacon transmitted on 38 frequencies simultaneously, steady and even, a pulse going out into the dark to find the people who were coming to find him. He listened to it the way you listen to your own heartbeat when everything else has gone quiet, not because you needed to check it, but because the sound of it was the sound of everything still being okay. He was still afraid. He had been afraid for 4.5 hours. The fear sat in his chest like a stone he'd learned to breathe around, and it would probably be there for a long time after this, surfacing in the small hours of the night in the way that combat fear always does, showing up in the grocery line 3 months from now when his hands shook for no reason he could explain. But the calculation had been simple. The beacon needed to run. He had stayed to run it. He had not unrun it when it became expensive. The choice was still the choice it had been when he made it. That was all. The TDF vessel, DSS Meridian Watch, named, in the particular irony of military procurement, before anyone knew who they'd be watching, arrived at Kessler 9 at the 5-hour and 58-minute mark to find the station intact, the beacon active, 47 surviving members of the original crew, and one Sergeant Dario Voss sitting on the floor of the beacon array room eating the other half of a chalk vanilla nutrition bar that he had been saving for when this was over. The rescue team found him by following the sound of the beacon. They came through the outer hatch with weapons drawn and found a room full of warm air and humming transmitter hardware and one Sergeant Dario Voss, sitting on the floor with his back against the bank, who looked up at them with the specific expression of a person who has been awake for 21 hours and is very aware of it but is not currently interested in doing anything about it. "Beacon's still running," he said. "You're 6 minutes early." The rescue team lieutenant, to her credit, didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the room. She looked at the inner hatch, the way it was sealed and wedged, the scorch marks from where the grenade had gone against the hinges, the dents in the metal from the other side that told a clear story about what had been happening outside it for the last few hours. She looked at the 2 Meridian soldiers who had made it into the room before he'd sealed it, who were no longer a concern. She looked at the nutrition bar wrapper on the floor. "Are you injured?" she said. "Bruised shoulder, tired." She looked at him for another moment. Then she put her weapon down to low ready and said, "Sir, with respect, what the hell?" "Beacon needed to run," he said. "Someone had to stay." He gave his debrief on the transport, flat on his back in the medical bay, answering questions from 3 separate TDF intelligence officers, while a medic checked him over and found nothing wrong except fatigue and a bruised left shoulder from a corridor wall he'd gone through faster than he'd intended. He answered all the questions fully and accurately, and declined the sedative the medic offered on the grounds that he wasn't done yet, and the medic made a note on his chart that he suspected meant something about stubbornness. The intelligence officers asked him about the communication exchange with the Meridian commander. They were very interested in this. They asked him to characterize the commander's tone. They asked him to analyze her apparent reasoning for withdrawing early. She had pulled out 11 minutes before her operational window required it, which was not standard Meridian doctrine and which had, apparently, surprised people considerably. They asked him what he thought it meant. They used words like unprecedented and unpredicted and operationally anomalous, which were the words intelligence officers used when something had happened that their models had not predicted, and they were not yet ready to adjust the models. He told them what she had said. He told them how she'd said it. He told them about the pauses, the specific quality of the pauses, which he thought mattered, and which he suspected they would not include in the official report. He told them about the 4.5 hours of her watching him on the cameras, the scout she'd sent after the first engagement, and then pulled back. He told them everything he could tell them with precision and accuracy. He did not tell them about the way she had said "I understood," because that part was between him and her, and he wasn't sure yet what to make of it. And the things he wasn't sure what to make of were things he needed to sit with in private for a while before he let them become official language in an intelligence debrief. There was something in the way she'd said it that was too careful, too deliberately offered to become data. It felt like it had been given to him specifically, and it should stay with him specifically, at least for now. The intelligence officers left. He lay in the medical bay and looked at the ceiling and thought about Commander Velarath of the 3rd Meridian Vanguard standing somewhere on her flagship. He was sure she was standing. He didn't know why he was sure, but he was. It felt consistent with the quality of her voice and the quality of the pauses, and the way she'd stayed on the comm for 2 minutes after the last thing either of them had said, just breathing, as if she wasn't ready to end the connection. Looking at a display of a station she'd failed to take, thinking about a word she didn't have. He thought about what it cost to admit you didn't have the word, to not reach for the nearest approximation and call it sufficient, to say instead, This exists and I cannot name it, and the gap is real. He thought about duty. He thought about the thing duty didn't quite cover. He'd used the word because it was the most honest approximation he had in the moment, but she was right that it carried obligation, contract, external architecture. What he'd actually done on Kessler 9 wasn't obligation. He'd been given the option to leave, had been encouraged to leave, had been explicitly told that his survival was a priority and the beacon was secondary. The 47 registered personnel had evacuated. He could have been on the transport. He'd stayed because the beacon mattered and he could do something about it, and those two facts, once connected, didn't let go. He thought about 46 people on evacuation transports. He thought about the camera in the corner that had been too high to be on his mental map. The one she'd been watching him on. He thought about her watching him eat the nutrition bar. He thought about what you must look like from the outside, when you are alone and afraid, and eating a nutrition bar in a 62-degree room while 800 soldiers try to come through your door. And he wondered if it had looked like the thing she was trying to find a word for, or if it had looked like something else entirely, like stubbornness, like stupidity, like the kind of obstinacy that produces outcomes no probability model would assign a meaningful likelihood to. Probably the latter, he thought. Probably from the outside, it mostly looked like stubbornness. He thought about her voice through the calm, the pauses, the way she'd said "I understood." He thought about 14 years of contact and 43 documented engagements, and what it would mean if the thing neither side fully understood about the other was not the tactics or the technology or the biological differences, but the space between a human being and a decision. That gap where everything rational argued for stopping and the person kept going anyway, and nobody had a word for it that was actually accurate. He thought about all of this, and then he stopped thinking about it and closed his eyes, because he was very tired and the ceiling wasn't going anywhere, and the beacon had done its job and so had he. He thought about the camera in the corner, the one that was too high to have been on his mental map and too small to have been worth disabling even if it had been. He thought about what she had seen through it, not the tactical picture, not the operational data, but the specific texture of a man alone in a hot room holding a hatch closed and eating a nutrition bar. The particular, ordinary, unglamorous reality of what it looked like to stay. He suspected it had not looked the way stories made it look. It had not looked like heroism, probably. It had looked like stubbornness, mostly, and like hunger, and like someone who had made a calculation, and was seeing it through with the specific unglamorous persistence that most of the worthwhile things in human history had actually been built on. He thought that was fine. He thought the unglamorous version was the honest one. He thought Velarath, in her 30 years of studying human conflict, might be one of the first people to have looked at the unglamorous version closely enough to understand that the unglamorous version was the point. He was asleep before the transport cleared the station's debris field. In the operational log for the 3rd Meridian Vanguard's engagement at Relay Station Kessler 9, Commander Velarath filed a post-engagement assessment that was notable in several respects. It contained the standard sections: force enumeration, timeline, objective status, tactical analysis, withdrawal reasoning. It was thorough and precise and accurate in every particular. But in the section reserved for enemy assessment, the category where Meridian commanders characterized the quality and nature of the human forces they had encountered as a predictive resource for future engagements, Velarath wrote only one thing. They have a word for it that is not accurate. We should find one of our own. No analyst who read the report was able to determine definitively what this referred to. It was flagged as unclear. It was sent back for clarification. She did not clarify it. She stood at her command platform in the quiet of her flagship's retreat from the Kessler 9 system, and she thought about a single human sergeant alone in a room with a beacon, afraid the entire time and present the entire time, choosing the entire time. And she understood that what she had watched, for 4 hours and 47 minutes was not a tactical anomaly to be accounted for. It was the thing she had spent 14 years trying to replicate, without knowing she was looking for it. It was why they lost. It was why they had always been losing. Not because humans were faster or smarter or better equipped or more violent or more adaptive or any of the 1,000 variables she had spent 30 years cataloging. Because a human being, when they decided something mattered, would sit in a 62-degree room alone and afraid and eating a nutrition bar, and they would hold that room. And no calculation in the Meridian operational vocabulary had a term for what that cost, or what it purchased, or why anyone would make that trade. She stood at her command platform for a long time after the station fell out of sensor range. She was trying to find the word. She had not found it by the time the system's star fell below the edge of her ship's horizon, dropping away behind them into the dark, smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light in a sky full of them. And Kessler 9 was gone, and the man in it was gone, and the beacon was gone, transmitting its patient pulse into the dark, looking for the people who were coming. She watched it go. She thought she might spend a long time looking for that word. She thought it would probably be worth it.